All right, what is our job? Our job is, it's defined a lot by who we are and how involved we want to get. I'm sorry, yeah, and if you're going to the Freedom Theater in Jenin, you're definitely on the right track. I think a good example is BDS, is boycott. Okay, boycott is probably the easiest form of resistance in supporting the Palestinian issue. You can do as little as just not buy sabra hummus or Israeli dates, which is important, or not buy HP or whatever it is that that's on the list, the BDS list, and that's good. If you want to get more involved, you go to the store manager and you say you shouldn't be selling sabra hummus because this and this and that. If you want to get more involved, then you start a BDS chapter. So there are lots of possibilities, but I think it's crucial that we change the conversation between us, even as activists, even as people who are already supposedly on the same side of the issue. There has to be a complete acceptance and recognition. The occupation of Palestine began 70 years ago. It began in 1948 to 1949. The entire existence of the State of Israel represents the problem. That is the occupation. That is the injustice. That is why we have a problem in Palestine. Now, granted, 6 million Jews are not going to get up and go away and disappear. At the same time, it is very different if you live in a country as a colonizer or as you live as an immigrant. And I have a very smart nephew, one of my sister's boys, Guy. He's an activist in Palestine, very active, and this is a distinction that he made to me once, and I think it's very true. It's very different if you come as an immigrant to a country and respect the country, or if you come as a colonizer, which means you take over and you completely ignore or kick out and kill the people whose country this is. And this is a conversation that we have to be having among us and not be afraid to talk about it in these terms otherwise. BDS is not anti-Semitic. BDS is legitimate, it is principled, it has worked in the past, people use it all the time. Suddenly against Israel, they legislate. In Europe, here in the United States, they're legislating against BDS, So this is a conversation that we have to have, again, among us and with our friends, and not to be afraid to say, yes, this is divisive, but this is a divisive issue. Racism is an issue that there is very little gray area. I oppose racism. Do you have what's your perspective? It's a question of values. There's very little gray area here. And this is an issue of racism and brutality and apartheid. And there can be very little argument here, very little gray area. And not to be afraid to push this forward. And to encourage people. People ask me, should we go visit Palestine? Is it safe? Of course you should go visit Palestine. Go visit Palestine and get involved in the Freedom Theater or get involved. There's thousands of different possibilities for people to go there and get involved through churches, through civic groups, all kinds of things. Go on your own. But I think going is probably one of the biggest contributions, and then making sure you spend your money on the Palestinian side and support the Palestinian side, and then see for yourself. There's a wonderful movie that just came out on YouTube. It's a documentary that this Chinese young man, he has this site called DIY, do-it-yourself, DIY travel. And he did a bit on Palestine. And the first thing he says is how cheap and accessible it is, and beautiful it is. And you look at this thing, and you wouldn't, it's wonderful because it focuses on Palestine. I grew up there. I know the place well. I felt like getting on a plane and going right back just to go to these beautiful places. So I think going there, getting involved, talking about it, this whole issue of a Palestine and an Israel is a myth. Israel has occupied Palestine, and this is very, very important, especially here in the United States. And like I said, I think Bernie Sanders did a very important thing when he made that comment during the debate, and then he called on Hillary Clinton for going to AIPAC. I think this is very important, and perhaps this is a beginning. But none of that can happen if we don't continue. And again, however involved we want to be, it's fine. Every level of involvement is good, and there are a lot of different options. But we have to act, and we have to do something, because as it is, this process is very slow, and Palestinians are dying. It's not a joke. The fear from BDS, that's a good question. Over the last few months, Israel's major newspaper, the Yediot Ahronot, has published a series of articles and reports about what they call the BDS. And the BDS is all the Palestine solidarity activity. They call it the BDS. So they wrote this, they had this whole series of articles. Then, while I was in Jerusalem, they co-sponsored with Stand With Us a major conference on how to combat the BDS. So I went to listen. The president of the state of Israel was there, cabinet members were there, journalists, Ron Lauder, American millionaires who support Israel were there. And on the one hand, they want to say, yes, this is this huge anti-Semitic monster that is coming to kill us, and it doesn't matter what we do, they're going to be against us. And on the other hand, they say, well, they're actually not doing much, we have nothing to be afraid of. And they can't decide which argument is more persuasive, but obviously they're worried because otherwise they wouldn't put together this major conference. And then Israeli TV, Channel 10, just came here to the United States to do a series about the BDS. And they interviewed me, they interviewed Noam Chomsky, they interviewed Palestinians, they interviewed activists on campuses again, and showing how this horrifying monster, Jew-killing monster, has come to the shores of America, and now, we are all being threatened. So there is a fear, and it's being perpetuated by the Zionist establishment, that BDS has nothing to do with the occupation, it has nothing to do with what we do to Palestinians, it's just anti-Semitism, it's age-old anti-Semitism, and so on. Completely disregarding the reality on the ground, completely disregarding the acts of the criminal acts of Israeli soldiers, the criminal policy of the Israeli government from the very beginning, as though none of that has anything to do with the sentiment, the anti-Israeli or the pro-Palestinian sentiment around the world. But they're afraid. Maybe they should be afraid. I think if things go well, as they should, then eventually we are going to see a transformation like we saw in South Africa, where the apartheid regime, or the Zionist regime, as it's called in Palestine, is forced to give up and is replaced through elections and through a democratic process with a democratic system, a democratic regime that represents everyone. And I'll say one more thing. I think Israelis will never be able to fully repay Palestinians for their crimes. This is not possible. The depth of the tragedy that was done to Palestinians by the Zionist movement and by Israelis cannot be overstated and can never be repaid. But we can make a sincere effort to make things better for everyone. And I do think that if the goals of the BDS are reached, or when they are reached, it'll create a reality on the ground that is better for Israelis as well as Palestinians. Because a democracy without the need for walls and this big army and arming yourself all the time is much better for everyone. In terms of the breaking point where I realized I was clearly anti-Zionist, I would say, I don't know there was a particular point, but I describe a moment in the book, the first time I traveled by myself in a car to the West Bank, with an Israeli car by myself, and the fear, and I thought I was going to die that day, and so on. But I remember going to Bilain, which is a town in the West Bank that's become quite famous now, and seeing the city that Israel built for Orthodox Jews on their land. It's called Modi'in Elit. And I'm looking up, and obviously billions and billions of dollars were invested. And all these new immigrant Orthodox Jews are coming in and moving in. And it occurred to me, this whole idea of the two-state solution is a myth. Because these buildings are not going away, these settlers are never going away, and actually these settlers are no different than me as a settler or other Israelis who live in other parts of the country. And then from that on, gradually I realized that the whole Zionist project was really a settler colonial project. And I don't want to have anything to do with it, I won't be associated with it, and that Zionism is today's apartheid. Of course, it's harder to argue because it's a beautiful word, it has all these biblical meanings and so on, so it's harder to argue against it. But Zionism is today's apartheid regime. So it was a process, I guess, that's how it was. It is absolutely crystal clear to anybody who's paying attention that there will never be a state of Palestine. That imaginary two-state solution scenario, it's science fiction. And it's absolutely clear to anybody who is paying attention. But there are other issues. And there is, I'll give you an example of what's happening in Europe. So in Europe, you've got a very strong Palestine solidarity movement. And the European governments are deeply in bed with Israel, profiting from the occupation and of Palestine, and profiting directly from Israeli policies against the Palestinians. That has been determined here in this room, by the way, by the Russell Tribunal a couple of years ago. So in order to appease their constituents, European governments have started this process of recognizing the state of Palestine. And like I said, there is no state of Palestine. There will never be a state of Palestine. The Palestinian Authority is not a state. It has less authority than a small city council. The Palestinian president, or so-called president, needs a permit from the Israeli army to travel from one Palestinian city to the other, and it's a permit that he has to renew every 6 months. So that is never happening. So my experience, what I see on the ground in Palestine, nobody respects the PA, nobody respects this idea of a two-state solution. Everybody realizes it is complete nonsense. And it's this farce that's being allowed to continue. I'm not going to define the PA one way or the other, but this is the reality on the ground. They have no authority. The so-called Palestinian police, or the so-called Palestinian security forces, have this thing, what they call the security cooperation with Israel. But it's very interesting because this cooperation only goes against Palestinians. In other words, they don't collaborate. Israelis don't work with the Palestinians to stop Israeli terrorism against Palestinians or Israeli attacks against Palestinians. It's only the Palestinian Authority stopping activists. And I've seen in protests where, on the Palestinian side, with Palestinian activists, with the Palestinian police, are shooting and arresting Palestinians who are protesting. So it's really more of a collaboration than a real attempt to bring about a solution and independence and Palestinian rights. Since it's never going to happen, there's nothing wrong with undermining it. I think we have to be absolutely forceful, absolutely clear. I gave a lecture in Washington, D.C. About a month ago, and the Palestinian, he's not called an ambassador, he's head of mission. And that's another humiliation that's beyond belief that they take. In every other country, they are at least considered ambassadors. Here, they don't even have diplomatic rights, or even the semblance of diplomatic rights. Anyway, he was there, the so-called ambassador, and he came up to me afterwards and he said, the things you're saying are kind of embarrassing to us. And being polite, I didn't reply, but my thoughts were, well, then, if the shoe fits, then that's how it's going to be. I don't think you should be here, representing something that doesn't exist. So there's a lot of, it's very disingenuous to pretend that there's going to be a Palestinian state, to have all these, and it's very similar, it's very typical of colonial powers, like when they leave Africa, they put some brute, and they call him a field marshal, and they give him lots of money, and then really the occupation and the colonization doesn't stop. They keep profiting from Africa, but they have the semblance of a state and a king or a president and so on, and now they're trying to impose that on the Palestinians. And this recognition of the state of Palestine is the same colonial trick that they did in other parts of the world when they left, and they're trying to do this on the Palestinians. I think the good thing is that the Palestinians aren't buying it, and the vast majority of Palestinians realize what this is. And I think as activists, we don't have to necessarily refer to it, but we can absolutely call for BDS, call for one state, call for the dismantling of the entire Zionist system and replacing it with democracy that would work for everyone. So that would be my response to that, to the whole issue of the state of Palestine. And undermining it, I think, is the right thing to do because it is a wake-up call, and there's no real chance of it ever happening. How to go to Palestine? Well, you buy a ticket, New York to Tel Aviv. You land, you get a visa. You don't say West Bank or Palestine or anything like that. You say that you come because you want to see Israel, and then you do what you want. You've got 3 months to do anything you want. Travel is very easy. Check out that DIY Palestine thing. It's got great tips. And bring a camera and just do what you want to do. And on the way out, just make sure, if you're leaving from Tel Aviv, also don't say anything about Palestine. Just say that you visited Israel and so on. And you'll have a trip of a lifetime. It's very easy. It's very accessible. There's buses and cabs, and it's very easy to travel, particularly in the Palestinian, on both sides. But in the Palestinian areas, it's very easy and very cheap to live, and you'll meet some great people.
What about Gaza?
Gaza's closed. Gaza, unless you work with a relief organization or you're a journalist and you get a permit, which takes a long time, and is really not even a guarantee of being allowed to get in. Gaza is a very sad story. I talk about my attempts to enter Gaza in the book, in the epilogue. I ended up having to go through a tunnel. That was the only way. But now they don't even have tunnels anymore because the Egyptians destroyed the tunnels. So that's a whole other story. But I would, there's plenty to do and plenty to see all over Palestine. You know, and the part of Palestine that is usually ignored is the Palestine that is considered Israel proper. It's you know, where the Palestinians with Israeli citizenship live. You know, some of those Palestinian cities look worse than refugee camps in the West Bank or in Gaza. Worse. As a result of the reality of the apartheid reality in what is among what is considered Israeli citizens. So the life of a Jew like myself in Israel, the life of a Palestinian in Israel, are completely different lives, completely different reality, and that would also make for an interesting, you know, an interesting trip. And so the anti-Semitism thing, yeah, you know, when you have no argument, then you start calling people names. I mean, not you, but that's what people do. When there's no argument, they start calling people names. Okay, you're an idiot. Okay, now, can we go back to the topic? Can you explain to me why it's okay for an Israeli soldier to execute a Palestinian on the ground who never did anything wrong to begin with and should not have been shot to begin with? Explain this to me, you know. Can you explain to me why Palestinians are denied water? Can you explain to me why 2 million people, or nearly 2 million people in Gaza, on a regular basis as a policy, are subjected to massacres? Massacre after massacre, where thousands of innocent civilians die, and the ones that don't die remain there without access to proper health care. That's how you deal with it. The only reason they use anti-Semitism and self-hating and all these other, you know, stupid names is because they have no argument. They want to steer away from talking about the issue. So they say anti-Semitism, and a lot of people are offended when they're called anti-Semites, you know. But the thing is, like Helena said, you get over it and you go back to the issue. Okay, let's assume I'm anti-Semitic. Can you explain this to me, though? Because if opposing Israeli policies is anti-Semitic, if opposing Israel is racist, what do you call people who support this monstrosity? What do you call yourself for supporting this? An entire nation is standing behind a soldier, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, the soldier who executed, and now the guy that was on the ground never did anything. He did not attack. He is not a terrorist. He did not attack the soldiers. Not that I think that attacking soldiers is terrorism, but he was not a terrorist. He did nothing wrong. He was at the wrong place at the wrong time. He had his hands up, and he was shot to the ground. Israeli ambulances drove right around him, knowing full well there was no threat. They're saying, oh, maybe he's got explosives. They knew that he didn't have explosives because he was checked. And I mean, he was just there. And then this young soldier shows up on the scene. He stops and speaks to an officer. It's very clear in the video. He hands this officer his helmet so his hands are free, walks up with his gun, shoots him in the head while the officer is looking. So he was either obeying an order or he had consent to do what he did. And he didn't think he was doing anything wrong. And most people don't in Israel.
And he first asks, is the dog still alive?
That's somebody else is asking. Somebody else on the video saying, oh, this dog is still alive. That's one of the paramedics. That's one of the paramedics saying, this dog is still alive. So that is the reality. So if opposing this is anti-Semitism, I'm perfectly fine with being anti-Semitic. But what do you call people who support this? What do you call a person who supports this kind of policy? And this just happened to come out because somebody took a video. And then the army has gone into the house of the man in Hebron who took the video and destroyed his home, and tried to take the video camera and destroy the video camera and so on. It's a reality that is absolutely impossible to believe. And I was in Hebron just a few days after that, sitting around with activists, and it's always very difficult for Palestinian activists there because they've got the settlers on the one hand, and this is, like I said, this is a breed of human beings that I don't know where they came from. And you've got these Israeli soldiers who protect them and support them. And the Palestinians are in the middle. And the Palestinians are not allowed to stab, they're not allowed to shoot rockets, they're not allowed to do BDS, they're not allowed to speak against Israel, they're not allowed to ask for the Jews to get the hell out. They need to sit there and be good and be quiet and hope that somebody will someday save them, you know. And that is the reality. So I think if we look at the big picture and pull away from the moment, where the anti-Semitism claim comes out, then we can go back to the conversation. That's what we need to do. So on the issue of Islamophobia, I think I agree with you. I think a great deal of Islamophobia here in this country is the result of work by organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, that pretends to be a civil rights organization and basically is a racist organization that promotes Zionism, and other kind of, and basically the infiltration and the very deep infiltration of the Israeli narrative, the Zionist narrative in America. So Arabs and Muslims have been shown to be the bad guys, you know, everywhere. It's the way the reality is presented in Palestine, and then there's an extension to the rest of the Middle East, and then of course there's an extension here as well. It's a very easy connection to make. And I think it's all related. I think, like I said earlier, with the case of the Holy Land Foundation, it's connected directly to the issue of Palestine. As long as there is this very strange relationship between the United States and Israel, it's going to be very difficult to argue against this, because they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars, you know, on their PR, and part of their PR is the defamation of Islam and Muslims and Arabs. You know, these are the bad guys, and we, the Israeli Jews, because we're like Americans and we share the same values and all this nonsense, we're the good guys, and therefore, you know, and so that's a, I think, working on the conversation, changing the conversation, making it clear that all of this stems from very deep racist and colonialist roots, is how we overcome it, is how we take over it. I think it's wrong for Muslims and Arabs to think that if they behave well, and if they sit quietly, and if they cooperate, then things are going to be okay. I think it's the opposite. I think you need to be able to stand up and say, this is nonsense, this is uncalled for, this is unjustified. And then to push back, because when you push back, that's when the other side moves, you know, retreats. But it's a big part of it, and I absolutely think that this is the two things are connected and related. And the way that you know, I'll give you an example. There's this claim that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, that Arabs are incapable. Look at all the Arab countries; there's not a single democracy. Okay, well, what happened when states around the world try or elect a democratically elected leader? What happened in Iran? What happened in the Congo? What happened in Egypt? What is happening in the West Bank with the Palestinians? Every single time the wrong person is elected, somebody steps in, kills them, and puts in some kind of a dictator. You know, the reason there are dictatorships, cruel dictatorships that are very strong in the Arab world, is because the Arabs around the world were never given the opportunity to create a democracy because of the money and the arms that are coming from America and now from Israel as well, supporting these vicious dictators, which then collaborate with them with their policies. You know, how is it that Sisi, you know, is being respected as the president of Egypt? You know, as a result of a coup. You know, but he collaborates well with Israel, he collaborates well with the United States. The same thing with Saudis. The same, you know. So but this is a myth that people believe. And they say, well, Arabs must be somehow, you know, not completely civilized, because look at the Arab world. You know, and of course then they come here and they're terrorists. So it's important to have these conversations and say, well, actually look at why this is the reality. You know, people say this about Africa, so they say, you know, blacks are, you know, there's something wrong with blacks. I mean, look at Africa, it's a mess. You know, and they've had independence for all these years, and look at it, it's a mess. Well, of course it's a mess. Who is ruling Africa? Who is providing money and arms for these ruthless dictators that are destroying Africa, that are allowing the former colonizers to destroy Africa? You know, so it's important to have the whole story and to have the conversation, and not to accept this, and not to accept their narrative. In terms of the story, yeah, you know, this is the new thing of the Zionist PR, is to say, well, you know, there are 800,000 Palestinians kicked out of Palestine, there are also 800,000 Jews kicked out of Arab countries, so we call it quits, which is, of course, complete nonsense. It is absolutely untrue and complete nonsense. The story of the Arab Jews and the reason they ended up leaving where they had, and it's a whole other story. You know, I mean, Iraq, the Jews didn't want to leave because they lived a good life and they were very happy there. The Mossad ended up putting bombs in synagogues to scare the Jewish community in Baghdad to leave. This is well documented. You know, it came out in the 80s. There was a unit, and I talk about it in the book, of Israeli army military intelligence that tried to do the same thing in Egypt. So, I mean, they were desperate to bring Jews. And the Jews in the Arab world were quite happy. So, I'm not going to get into the whole story, but trying to compare this to this is complete nonsense, even if it is true. Even if it was true, there's nothing to do with it. You know, there's a refugee problem. These people were kicked out of their homes in Palestine. They deserve to return, regardless of how or why or what else happened around the world. These people have a right to return. The United Nations resolution called for their return, and Israel must allow it, even if it means the end of the State of Israel, which it probably does, which, again, like I said earlier, is not altogether a bad thing. So that's that story, but it's a complete myth. There are lots of Palestinians speaking out, but you need to pay attention, and you need to, you know, I mean, they're obviously not. I heard this from a former congressman the other day. I said to him, you know, a lot of former congressmen and former, you know, politicians in America suddenly have a moment, like an aha moment. How did we, you know, they go to Palestine with their church or with somebody, and they say, we had no idea. So I confronted this one former congressman who was a Democrat, and I said, you mean all these years you were in Congress, you approved $3 billion in foreign aid, and you didn't know what was going on? He said, no, you know, he says, AIPAC people come to my office every day. Nobody from the other side ever comes. I said, really? Because you don't answer the phone when they call, and you don't let them in the door. What is this hypocrisy? You know, so I think it's a lot harder for the Palestinian voices to be heard, but there are lots of Palestinian voices. There are many Palestinian activists, and I'm not talking about the official Saeb Barakat, Hanan Ashrawi, who are part of the PA. I'm talking about grassroots leaders, leaders from the villages, leaders from the popular resistance that have lately been getting visas to come visit the U.S., which is a big transition. It's a big change, because in the past they wouldn't be given visas because they have a history of being in prison. The reason they were in prison is because they are resisting the State of Israel. So now that has changed a little bit, and some of them are being allowed to come here, and they've been here several times, and they come on talks, and they speak at different universities and so on, or even here in New York. So it's just, you know, I think maybe you can go on Facebook and take a look at it, or go online and take a look at the Palestinian popular resistance. But there are plenty of Palestinians out there who are speaking, but it's harder for them to speak out and to be heard and to be recognized than it is for somebody like me. That's just kind of the racist reality in which we live. But there are a lot of Palestinian voices, both in Palestine, outside of Palestine, here in the U.S., like I said, BDS, on the college campuses, and visiting Palestinians who come to speak. But again, I'm not talking about the official line of the PA and the UN. I'm talking about the grassroots movement, the real leaders of the Palestinian resistance, which were a lot younger and more effective. You know, the problem with the UN, there are a lot of problems with the UN. But first of all, none of the UN resolutions against Israel are not enforceable, number one. Number two, a lot of the UN, the so-called suggested ideas and suggested solutions are all within the framework of accepting the State of Israel. So accepting the myth that the first part of the majority of occupied Palestine should be legitimized as the State of Israel and forgotten, and only that small portion of Palestine, which is the West Bank and Gaza, should be discussed. And of course it can't be discussed because Israel will never allow it. So it's kind of this crazy catch-22, and America plays a part, the EU plays a part, the UN plays a part, and they all play a part in this insane saga, which everybody knows will lead to nothing. But the UN can't just come back and say, okay, we don't recognize the State of Israel, we don't recognize the occupation of Palestine from 1948 to 1967. So this is going to be the framework. They can't do that. They don't have the power to do that, and I suspect they won't. I think the UN and the US and the EU will all come to terms with the reality once we, as activists, force that reality upon them. So if we compare it to South Africa, one day, as a result of grassroots movement and strong BDS activity, the entire world, including the US and the Europeans, accepted that boycotting South Africa and isolating South Africa is the right thing to do, supporting Nelson Mandela is the right thing to do, and then several years after that, de Klerk came up and said, okay, it's over. He didn't do it because he was a saint. He did it because he had no choice. The world brought South Africa to its knees, and there was no other way out. This, I expect, is what's going to happen. And then all these big organizations and the U.S. will follow suit. They're not going to lead it. They're going to agree to it once they have no choice, as politicians usually do. So again, it's like I said, it's because it's part of this insane myth and this catch-22 reality. I don't expect anything is going to come out of an American president, or out of the EU, or out of the United Nations. It has to be grassroots. It has to be bottom up, and it's all up to us. Okay. Thank you very much. All right.
Miko, on behalf of the working group, on behalf of those who have heard you today, on behalf of those who read your books, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, your time, your witness, and your passion.